The private hospital in Savannah held its breath in sterile silence. The marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights polished so often that their reflection could blind anyone who stared too long. The air was sharp with the tang of disinfectant, but inside room 412, another scent lingered: white roses in a crystal vase, their fragrance both delicate and defiant against the clinical atmosphere. They had been placed there by Charles Whitaker, a man whose every gesture appeared tender to anyone watching. He was 29 years old that morning, a husband sitting vigil at his comatose wife's bedside. To the nurses, he seemed like the portrait of devotion fingers, curled protectively around Eleanor's unmoving hand, head bowed in apparent grief. But Eleanor, only 25, pale against the sheets, was not completely gone. A tumor had thrust her into a coma just hours earlier, her body still and her life dependent on the humming machines around her. The steady hiss of oxygen, the precise beep of monitors were all that betrayed her fragile hold on existence. To everyone else, she was silent, unreachable. But inside her mind burned with a fragile clarity. She could not speak, could not open her eyes, yet she could hear every word, every whisper that sliced the air around her. And Charles's whispers were not those of love. He leaned close to her ear when the hallway was empty and nurses had stepped away. His voice lowered, smooth, almost gleeful. "This," he murmured, "is the best birthday gift you could ever give me. I couldn't have dreamed of anything better." The words stabbed through the fog of Eleanor's mind, snapping her deeper into awareness. Fear churned, but behind it came something sharper: betrayal so pure it suffocated her. She wanted to scream, to sit up, to expose him. But her tongue was stone, her limbs useless weights. All she could do was listen. The door creaked softly. Charles's mask returned in an instant. He pressed his face into the sleeve of his borrowed hospital gown, producing sobs on command. "Eleanor, my sweet girl," he said aloud, his voice cracking in manufactured despair. He even rubbed his eyes raw with a linen napkin so the moisture could pass for tears. When Dr. Harold Jennings entered, a man with salt-gray hair and weary eyes, he found only a grieving husband. "I'm sorry to intrude, Mr. Whitaker," the doctor said, holding out a clipboard, "but I need your signature on these documents." Charles looked up, his face a portrait of agony. "Doctor," he said, voice heavy, "please tell me the truth. How is she really?" Jennings hesitated, his composure faltering for just a second. "Your wife is stable, but still critical," he admitted. "We've done what we can to relieve the swelling. But recovery is unpredictable. Weeks, perhaps, months, sometimes years before we know if she'll awaken." Charles lowered his gaze, shaking his head as if crushed. "But not soon. Isn't that right? You must be honest with me." He leaned forward, his voice soft, persuasive. "I must prepare. If the worst happens, there are legal papers, financial matters, things that take time." Jennings frowned. "It's too early for that. We cannot predict outcomes so narrowly. Your wife is young. There is always a chance." Charles's eyes darkened, though his tone remained measured. He studied the doctor carefully. Rumors had already reached him Jennings's fondness for whiskey, his debts from late-night card games with colleagues. Weaknesses Charles could exploit. "So what you're saying," Charles murmured, "is that her chance of returning to full capacity in the next year or two is essentially zero." The doctor stiffened. "Not zero," he said reluctantly, "but small." A thin smile curved across Charles's lips. He leaned back, voice cooling to calculation. "Then let me be plain. What if I asked you to help ensure she remains as she is, not forever, just long enough for me to settle affairs? Then when the time is right, we withdraw the machines." Horror flickered across Jennings's face. "Mr. Whitaker," That would be unethical. I swore an oath. I'm not asking you to kill her, Charles interrupted smoothly. Merely to ease up, less aggressive treatment, lower doses, let nature take its course. The surgeon's throat bobbed as he swallowed. You're asking me to neglect my duty. I'm offering you a choice, Charles replied. He pulled out his phone thumb, sliding across the screen until a figure appeared 5 digits. Enough to tempt. Jennings froze. Charles flicked his thumb again, and the number swelled to 6 figures. Would this be sufficient? The doctor's eyes flickered, shame and greed colliding. His lips trembled. What did she ever do to you? He whispered. Charles smirked. That's none of your concern. I'm not paying you to judge me. I'm paying you to make sure she doesn't get better. Jennings turned away, muttering something about God and conscience. But Charles's voice followed, low and dangerous. Think it over. Your debts won't pay themselves. And remember, this conversation never happened. When the surgeon left, Charles brushed his wife's limp fingers, his expression devoid of tenderness. Stay quiet, darling, he whispered. Just the way I need you. But Eleanor was not silent inside. Rage flared hot, fusing with memory. She was 5 again, standing in the rain outside a Savannah orphanage, abandoned with nothing but a name. Years later, a kind couple, Nicholas and Marjorie Hayes, had taken her into their modest brick home. They gave her a bedroom with curtains, a father who introduced her proudly as his daughter, a mother who tucked her in at night, and Violet, her grandmother in spirit, if not by blood, who taught her to tend a garden of herbs, whispering, "Life will test you, child, but love will always be stronger than cruelty." That memory bound her to herself. She repeated it silently like a vow. I will not let him win. I will not give him my company, my legacy, my life. Her tongue twitched faintly. Her jaw moved a fraction. Tiny, invisible victories that ignited her determination. The door clicked shut. Charles had left. But then his voice drifted from the hallway, smooth and conspiratorial. Yes, Lydia, I'm still at the hospital. Don't worry, I'll stop by tonight. I just need to meet with the attorney. I want to know exactly what rights I'll have once Eleanor is gone. Her heart thundered, the monitor quickening. Lydia Moore. A name she remembered from a gala, a socialite with a perfect smile standing too close to her husband. Now everything fell into place. Eleanor's lips trembled, biting blood into her mouth, forcing herself to stay conscious. She tasted betrayal like poison. That night, when the halls dimmed for the night shift, Grace Turner, a young nurse with bright, sharp eyes, leaned over to adjust Eleanor's IV. She paused. Her gaze narrowed. She had seen it, a faint tremor in Eleanor's lips, the flutter of eyelids. "Mrs. Whitaker?" Grace whispered. She bent closer. To her shock, Eleanor's lips moved again, forming the faintest rasp. "Don't trust him." Grace froze. "Who?" Eleanor's voice cracked out fragments. "Charles! Doctor!" Grace's stomach dropped. She looked into Eleanor's eyes, weak but burning with clarity. This wasn't delirium. It was warning. "They want to harm you?" Grace asked softly. A single tear slipped from Eleanor's eye. It was enough. Grace's pulse pounded. She looked toward the door, then back at Eleanor. "They'll never believe me if I say this aloud," she whispered. "Not against him, not against Dr. Jennings. But I believe you. I'll help." Eleanor exhaled a broken word. "Out." Grace's mind raced. Then she nodded with sudden resolve. She scribbled an address on her notepad, Aunt Lucille, a healer on the outskirts near Waycross. Folks laughed at her remedies, but Grace had seen them work. She folded the slip into Eleanor's palm, curling the limp fingers around it. "But we'll have to move before dawn," she whispered. "The guards switch shifts at 4. That's when the halls are quietest." She drew a dose of medication. This will give you a little strength. Not much, but enough to hold on. Warmth spread through Eleanor's veins. Fog lifted slightly. Hope sparked where none had been. Listen to me, Grace murmured, her young face etched with courage. You are not alone. Tonight, we fight back. Eleanor wanted to thank her, but all she managed was a breath. Hope. Grace smiled faintly. Yes, hope. Outside footsteps echoed. Charles returning perhaps, or Dr. Jennings on his rounds. Grace straightened, hiding every sign of conspiracy. But inside, her heart beat with a vow. By dawn, Eleanor Whitaker would not be a silent prisoner of room 412. She would be free, and Charles Whitaker would never see it coming. The hospital never truly slept, but in the hours before dawn, it came closest. The overhead lights dimmed to a muted glow, and the shuffle of staff softened to whispers. Room 412 was hushed, except for the faint hiss of oxygen, but Eleanor's mind blazed with a single thought escape. Grace slipped into the room, her sneakers silent on the polished floor. She had changed out of her uniform, hiding beneath a plain hoodie and cap, her pockets jingling faintly with borrowed keys. Her face was calm, but her heart hammered in her chest. She leaned close to Eleanor's bed. It's time. Eleanor's eyelids fluttered open, heavy but responsive. Grace slid an arm beneath her shoulders and began disconnecting the monitors one by one, silencing their alarms with swift fingers. The machines faded into silence. Eleanor tried to rise, her muscles trembling with forgotten purpose. Grace braced her weight, whispering encouragement. One step at a time. You can do this. They moved into the hallway shadows stretching across the floor. Every sound magnified: the squeak of slippers, the soft thud of Grace's shoes, the distant ring of a phone. Twice they pressed flat against the wall as orderlies wheeled carts past. Eleanor's chest heaved with effort, her body weak and slick with sweat, but her eyes burned with determination. At last, they reached the service exit. Grace's fingers fumbled with the keys, then the heavy lock clicked open. Cool night air rushed in, damp with the scent of asphalt and pine from Savannah's outskirts. Eleanor inhaled deeply, her first taste of freedom in days. Grace guided her to the bus stop, just beyond the hospital grounds. This is where I leave you, she whispered. I've called in a favor. The driver knows to wait. He won't ask questions. She clasped Eleanor's cold hands. Don't thank me. Just live. Show him he didn't win. Eleanor's lips moved around a broken whisper. Thank you. Grace shook her head, tears shimmering in her eyes. Go. She kissed Eleanor's forehead and disappeared back into the shadows. Moments later, the bus pulled up with a hiss of brakes. The driver, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes, lowered the steps. Without a word, he helped Eleanor aboard. She sank into a seat, clutching the slip of paper with Aunt Lucille's address against her chest like a talisman. The ride was long. The city lights blurred into darkened roads lined with oaks. Every bump rattled her bones, every jolt threatened to drag her back into unconsciousness. But she clung to wakefulness, repeating her vow, I will survive. I will make him pay. At last, the bus screeched to a halt at a dirt road. That's as close as I can get, the driver said softly. Someone's waiting. Through her haze, Eleanor saw a figure standing in the moonlight, wrapped in a shawl, silver hair glinting. Aunt Lucille. When Eleanor's legs buckled, the old woman caught her arm strong despite her years. Child Lucille murmured, steady as stone, you made it this far. God isn't done with you yet. Eleanor collapsed against her, finally surrendering to darkness. She woke in a small farmhouse room, filled with the scent of dried herbs, hanging from rafter shelves, lined with jars labeled in looping script. The glow of a kerosene lamp painted everything in warmth. Lucille sat at her side, pressing a cloth steeped in pungent infusion against her temple, humming softly. "You're safe now," Lucille said firmly. "But the road back will be long. You've been broken, child, but not beyond repair." At first, Eleanor recoiled from the strange brews and bitter tinctures Lucille offered. They tasted like earth and roots, far from the sterile procedures she had trusted. But day after day, Lucille tended her with patience. Slowly, strength returned. The pain dulled. Each morning, Lucille pulled her to the window. "The sun heals more than you know." Each evening, she prayed aloud, her voice wrapping Eleanor in comfort. Weeks blurred into months. Muscles that had withered stirred again. First trembling steps across the wooden floor, then careful walks along the porch. By the third month, she could chop vegetables in the kitchen, her hands steady. By the fifth, she walked the fields, lungs filling with southern air. Each step reminded her she was alive. Each breath carried her further from the helpless woman in the hospital bed. But the body's healing was only half the battle. At night, memories returned with Venom Charles's whisper, "The best birthday gift you could give me," and Lydia's name murmured with certainty. Rage surged alongside gratitude. She prayed, sang hymns with the small church choir, and felt strength flow through her. Yet beneath every prayer lay a blade sharpened and waiting. 9 months passed. Her hair grew long, her skin glowed again, her voice carried steady when she read scripture aloud. Neighbors called her a miracle, a testament to God's grace. Eleanor bowed her head politely, but inside she carried another truth. Her survival was not only grace, it was defiance. One evening, walking home from church, she heard muffled cries from a shack at the edge of town. The sobs of a child froze her steps. She pushed open the door. Inside, the air reeked of liquor. A woman slumped with a bottle, her voice sharp with rage. In the corner, a boy no older than 6 cowered his arms, shielding his head. Eleanor's voice cut through the room. "Enough." The drunken woman stumbled away, muttering. Eleanor knelt by the boy. His cheeks were wet, his lips split. When she reached for him, he flinched until his eyes met hers. Eyes so full of pain, it hollowed her. She softened her tone. "You're safe now. No one will hurt you." The boy trembled, then collapsed against her chest, clinging with desperate strength. From that night, he shadowed her steps. She fed him, wrapped him in lavender-scented blankets. Slowly, laughter returned to his voice. He began to call her mom without hesitation, as if his soul had chosen her. Weeks later, a man knocked at Lucille's door. Tall, dusty from the mind's eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Thomas Green, the boy's father. He had been working double shifts, sending money home, never realizing the truth. When he saw his son safe, clean, and sleeping peacefully, relief broke across his face. Gratitude shone raw in his eyes as he looked at Eleanor. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice rough. "No thanks needed," she replied. He just needed someone to stand up for him. But Thomas returned often, sometimes for supper, sometimes just to talk while his son played outside. Trust grew between them, tentative but steady. Eleanor found herself drawn to his kindness, his unassuming steadiness. He seemed to sense the fire beneath her calm exterior, never pressing, simply offering presence. Yet when silence grew heavy between them, when their eyes lingered too long, Eleanor's heart pulled back. She could not give herself to anyone yet, not while Charles still walked free, not while betrayal still haunted her. One quiet morning, a newspaper landed on Lucille's table. The headline blazed, "Whitaker Moore Union promises Savannah's wedding of the year." Charles's hand rested on Lydia's waist, her diamond ring flashing under the camera. Eleanor's breath caught. Months of healing had not dulled the memory of his betrayal. Seeing him exalted, flaunting triumph tore open the wound anew, but this time, anger rose with resolve. She read every detail, the date, the venue, the guest list. A plan formed clear and unwavering. For months, she had hidden biding her time. Now, the moment had come. She folded the paper, neatly sealing her vow. Lucille watched, recognizing the steel in her posture. "You've made up your mind." "Yes," Eleanor said softly. "I'm going back to Savannah." "Then go with truth in your hands, child," Lucille replied. "Let it be your weapon." That night, Eleanor lay awake thinking of Thomas and the boy of hymns sung in the little white church of her father's pride and Violet's words. Love will always be stronger than cruelty. But love, she now knew, could also take the shape of justice. At dawn, she packed a small bag. Her body was no longer frail. Her spirit stood tall. With Lucille's blessing echoing in her ears, she left the farmhouse. She was ready to face Charles Whitaker and reveal the truth he thought would remain buried forever. The grand ballroom of Savannah's most prestigious hotel glittered with chandeliers that rained light across polished marble floors. Dozens of floral arrangements perfumed the air with orchids, roses, and lilies, their extravagance more about spectacle than sentiment. Guests in shimmering gowns and tailored tuxedos murmured with anticipation as waiters wove through the crowd carrying trays of champagne flutes. The city's elite had gathered for what the society pages promised would be the wedding of the year. At the center of it all stood Charles Whitaker, immaculate in his tuxedo chest, puffed with pride. Beside him, Lydia Moore dazzled in a gown of silk and pearls, her diamond ring catching every flicker of light. Together, they embodied triumph, or so it seemed. Lydia basked in the envy of the crowd, while Charles soaked up admiration as though it were his birthright. They had carefully constructed the illusion of power and love, and tonight was to be its crowning moment. But hidden among the guests, unnoticed in the background, stood Eleanor Whitaker. She wore the modest attire of a church volunteer assigned to help with the event, a plain dress and scarf that drew no eyes. By her side walked the young boy she had rescued months earlier, his small hand steady in hers. No one questioned their presence. They blended seamlessly into the hum of attendants and servers. Beneath her calm exterior, Eleanor's heart thundered with the weight of truth. Her satchel lay tucked safely against her side, filled with documents she had gathered with painstaking care, medical records, financial statements, and the testimony Grace Turner had risked her career to provide. Proof of Charles's betrayal. Proof that tonight's marriage was built on lies. She waited in silence, listening as the officiant's voice rang out solemn and theatrical. "If anyone here knows any reason these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, speak now or forever hold your peace." The words hung in the air. Silence followed, heavy and expectant. Charles's smile broadened. Lydia squeezed his hand. Guests leaned forward in their seats, eager for vows and spectacle. Then Eleanor stepped forward. Her heels clicked softly against marble as she crossed the aisle, the boy's hand in hers. At first, only a few heads turned. Whispers of confusion spread. Then recognition rippled like wildfire. Gasps broke through the quiet. Phones lifted, cameras flashed. Faces shifted from curiosity to shock as they realized who she was. Charles's jaw slackened, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked as though he had seen a ghost. "Eleanor!" he croaked, his voice cracking. Lydia's grip tightened on his arm, her face paling beneath layers of makeup. Eleanor reached the front, steady in her steps, her gaze locked on Charles. She took the microphone from the stunned officiant. Her voice trembled at first, but with each word it grew stronger. "My name is Eleanor Whitaker," she said, sweeping her eyes over the guests. Yes, Eleanor. The wife Charles buried in whispers and lies. The woman he prayed would never wake again. A hush fell, demanding every ear. You sit here today to witness a wedding built on betrayal? She continued, her tone sharp. But before you raise your glasses to toast, you should know the truth. Charles conspired with Dr. Harold Jennings to keep me in a coma to let me die, so he could inherit my company, my money, my life. The ballroom erupted. Shocked murmurs filled the air. Lydia recoiled, horror flickering across her perfect mask. Eleanor unfolded papers from her satchel, holding them up with deliberate care. These are my medical records altered under his instruction. And here are financial statements, proof that while I lay unconscious, Charles drained accounts, siphoned funds, and let Whitaker Construction collapse under his greed. Charles lunged toward her, but Eleanor stood unmoved. Security hesitated, held back by the guests themselves, curiosity rooting them to the drama. And if you doubt my word, Eleanor pressed on, voice steady as steel, asked Grace Turner. A nurse who risked everything to save me, who heard what I heard, who saw what I saw. The crowd turned, eyes darting between Charles and Lydia, judgment heavy in the air. A senator's wife whispered furiously to her husband. A banker shook his head with disgust. Cameras flashed in relentless succession, capturing Charles's unraveling in real time. Lydia's face drained of color. She pulled her hand from his grasp, stepping back as though distance could erase her complicity. You told me she was gone? She hissed, her words audible to those nearest. Eleanor's gaze remained locked on Charles. You once told me that my silence was the greatest gift I could give you. But today, Charles, I give you something greater, the truth. The ballroom crackled with electricity, a storm of outrage and fascination. Guests rose from their seats, some shouting, some recording, all bearing witness to the collapse of a man who had thought himself untouchable. Charles's composure shattered. His face twisted, his words stumbling. She's lying. All of it, he cried, desperation bleeding into his voice. But no one believed him. The evidence was in Eleanor's hands, and the woman he had condemned had risen stronger than ever. The officiant cleared his throat, attempting to restore order, but the ceremony was over. The grand wedding, the glittering illusion, had crumbled into dust. Guests streamed toward the exits, muttering about scandal, betrayal, and ruin. Lydia tore off her veil, fleeing through a side door, her dreams dissolving into shame. And Charles Whitaker, once admired and envied, stood abandoned in the center of the ballroom, his empire gone. His reputation destroyed, his future reduced to nothing. Eleanor lowered the microphone, her chest rising with steady breath. The boy squeezed her hand tighter, and she looked down at him with a faint smile. For the first time since her coma, she felt whole. Justice had been spoken aloud. In the days that followed, Savannah buzzed with scandal. Newspapers that had once praised Charles now tore him apart with headlines sharp as knives. Society pages that had fawned over Lydia ridiculed her as a gold digger caught in her own web. Overnight, their names became synonymous with greed, deceit, and downfall. Whitaker Construction, already bleeding under Charles's reckless leadership, collapsed entirely. The board convened in emergency meetings. Lawyers swarmed the offices. Creditors circled like vultures. Charles, stripped of his power, was ousted. His assets were frozen. The company Eleanor had built was finally free of him. Lydia vanished from Savannah's ballrooms, her jewels pawned quietly, her friends scattering. She became a cautionary tale, whispered behind lace fans and wine glasses. Beauty without integrity could not buy respect. Charles's fall was merciless. Abandoned, mocked, destitute, he disappeared into obscurity. Some said he fled to Atlanta, others swore they saw him boarding a bus west with a single suitcase. Wherever he went, it was not with dignity, but disgrace. Eleanor, however, did not linger in the city that had nearly buried her. She returned to the countryside to Lucille's farmhouse, where fields stretched wide and air tasted of freedom. There, Thomas Green welcomed her with steady eyes, his son clinging to her hand as though she were already family. Life settled into a rhythm both gentle and profound. Eleanor helped Thomas repair the old barn. She laughed as the boy chased fireflies across the yard. Evenings were spent on the porch, the scent of honeysuckle drifting in the air, as Thomas told stories of the mines, tales of resilience, and finding light in the dark. Between them, trust deepened into something more slow and unhurried. Thomas, never pressed, her never demanded more than she could give. He simply stood beside her, steady and kind. In his presence, Eleanor discovered a peace she had once thought impossible, but she also knew the truth. Her story was not only about vengeance, it was about rebuilding, about reclaiming a life once stolen. The Georgia countryside shifted with the seasons from the sharp bite of winter to the honeyed warmth of spring. Eleanor found rhythm in it, all rising with the sun working alongside Lucille in the herb garden, laughing with the boy who now called her mom, and walking at dusk with Thomas, whose presence was steady as the earth itself. The chaos of Savannah felt like another lifetime, but the scars it left shaped the woman she had become. She learned to live again not as a victim, but as someone who had fought through betrayal and darkness. Each step through the fields reminded her she had survived not by chance, but by choice. Each prayer in the small white church echoed with gratitude, but also with an understanding she had earned through fire survival was more than breathing. It was deciding to rise again and again. Thomas and his son became anchors in her life. They filled the farmhouse with laughter, with small, ordinary joys. A mended chair, a loaf of fresh bread, a lantern glowing late into the evening while stories were told. Slowly, gently trust deepened into love. It was not sudden, nor was it dramatic. It was the kind of love that built itself brick by brick with patience and truth, never demanding, always offering. One Sunday morning, the little church at the end of the lane filled with voices raised in song. Eleanor walked between Thomas and the boy, hand in hand. She wore no satin, no pearls, only a simple dress and a heart that had learned how to endure. The congregation smiled as they passed, whispering blessings, seeing not scandal, but redemption. At the altar, when the pastor prayed over them, Eleanor closed her eyes, a tear slipping free, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. She had lost everything once, yet here she was, surrounded by a love that was true, a family chosen, not forced. As the hymn swelled, her voice joined strong and steady. She looked at Thomas, at the boy, and her heart brimmed with certainty. The pain of betrayal had not vanished, but it had been transformed into strength, into resilience, into life. Outside, the morning sun bathed them in gold as they left the church, three shadows moving in rhythm. Eleanor knew her story was no longer about loss or revenge. It was about survival, truth, and the choice to love again. Yet she also understood something deeper. Justice was not always served in courtrooms or headlines. Sometimes justice arrived quietly in the peace that comes from living well, while those who betrayed you vanished into obscurity. Charles had taken his shot at destroying her, but in the end, he destroyed only himself. His silence became his prison, while her voice had set her free. Eleanor built a new legacy. She established a small foundation in Violet's name, helping young women learn trades, sign their own contracts, and stand tall in their independence. She visited work sites with pairs of sturdy boots and hard hats, telling them, "Silence can be a word, but you also have the right to speak loudly." She taught them that survival was not enough, that thriving was the truest form of defiance. She returned once to Savannah, passing by the old Whitaker home. She didn't enter, didn't pause. She left divorce papers in her lawyer's hands and walked away. There was no dramatic confrontation, no last words. Only closure sealed, like a door shut for good. Years later, the memory of room 412 still came back. Sometimes the hiss of oxygen, the whisper of betrayal. But it no longer held her captive. It reminded her only of what she had overcome, of the vow she had fulfilled. I will not let him win. And she hadn't. Standing on the porch of the farmhouse one evening, the fields glowing orange in the sunset, Thomas at her side, and the boy laughing in the yard, Eleanor understood the lesson written across her journey. Life will test you with cruelty, but love, real love, chosen love, will always be stronger. And truth once spoken can shatter even the darkest lies. Her story had begun in silence, with words she could not speak. But it ended in light with a voice steady enough to carry through any storm. If this story touched, you don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Your voice matters, let it be heard. And